for it.
All right. Hello, good evening. My name is Marisa Haetzman. This is Christopher Brookmyre. Together we write as Ambrose Parry. We are delighted to be able to speak to you all this evening about our writing collaboration. And we're very grateful to the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh for inviting us to take part in this event. Obviously, we would far rather be at the Royal College of Physicians, but in the current circumstances, we're delighted to be able to do this event online. I think I should point out before we start that there is no social distancing going on because we are part of the same household, so we're not breaking any rules here. And I think it's a little awkward because we can't see you at all, so we're assuming someone's listening to our chat here. But basically what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the books that we've written, the historical background, which is really, I think, one of the most interesting parts of the whole thing. And it's of some significance to the Royal College of Physicians because we focus so much on the inhabitants of 52 Queen Street, James Young Simpson, his family, and those who work with him. And the books all take place around the time of the discovery of chloroform. So we're going to kind of chat to each other a little bit. I'm going to kind of run through some questions we've thought of ourselves. And then at the end, there's a opportunity for anyone watching to ask questions and we will endeavour to answer them. So first of all, just so that you know what it is we're talking about, we wrote our first novel, The Way of All Flesh, which was published in 2018, yes. And most recently, The Art of Dying, which has just been published in paperback last month. So again, just to introduce ourselves properly, Christopher Brookmyre, and this is my first question, Christopher Brookmyre, international best-selling and multi-award winning novelist who has written more than 20 novels under his own name. Why did you want to collaborate with an anaesthetist who had no experience of creative writing?
Well, first of all, I'm realising that I've had many introductions in my time and they often get things wrong, but you would have the least excuse for getting the details wrong. And well, why would I want to collaborate? I suppose it didn't occur to me to collaborate with anybody. It never would have, because the great thing about being a novelist is having so much control over your work. And I hadn't envisaged collaborating with anybody, least of all my wife, who isn't from the kind of creative arts. And essentially, like any novel, it all comes down to a good idea, or certainly what seems like a good idea at the time. Mm-hmm. And as a writer, you're always looking for the next thing that's going to inspire you. And I think what inspired me was what you were telling me. Marisa decided in around about late 2012, early 2013 to do a master's in the history of medicine and took some time off. Should point out that Marisa hasn't mentioned in depth that she is an anaesthetist of 20 years experience. She's also a member of the Royal College of Physicians, actually. But she was doing this master's in the history of medicine, and as her dissertation was on James Young Simpson. And it seemed like every night when you came home, you would tell me more remarkable things about James Young Simpson. And when it comes to the world of science and the history of science, history of medicine, you're normally told about the great deeds of these esteemed individuals. And they're defined by their deeds. And often people are inspired by that and try and write novels based on their lives. And they run into the problem that they're not always relatable people, or that their work might define them, but the human element is problematic to telling a story. And this was not the case with Simpson. It was what really lit me up was hearing the human element of this. What seemed to drive Simpson was his humanity. What seemed to be at the heart of his desire to come up with something better than ether was this constant need to alleviate suffering. And that, it seemed to me, stemmed from the picture that was being painted of him. And it was a picture being painted kaleidoscopically through these wee fragments of what his home life was like, or what he was like as a character. And every night you seem to tell me a new vignette or anecdote about what life was like in 52 Queen Street, or Simpson's practice, the fact that he had his practice in his house, or the things he got up to, and the fact that all of Edinburgh seemed to come through the door of 52 Queen Street. And I'm not someone who ever imagined writing historical fiction. And we often laugh about this, that I used to say I sometimes have a notion for historical fiction, and the one period I said I would never write about was the Victorian period, because I thought that doesn't seem to inspire me. And what I love about this job is that you're often confounded by your own expectations. The story of Simpson just made me think, this is something nobody has beaten us to. It's one of the most remarkable discoveries in the history of medicine and science. You know, the discovery of chloroform changed medicine and surgery. It had just incalculable ramifications, and yet nobody had really told that story in drama or in fiction. And I remember saying this to you, nobody's beaten us to this. We should write this together, which is quite a bold thing to say to somebody who's not ever done any writing.
Well, certainly, I thought you were joking the first few times you mentioned it. But I think I would agree with you that the thing that was really inspiring was Simpson himself. And I remember telling you so many stories about his life and the sort of man he was. And I think possibly things like the discovery of chloroform itself, it was such a fantastic story. For those of you who maybe not know, Simpson was very keen on improving on ether, which had been discovered in 1846. And for the whole of the summer of 1847, he and his assistants were experimenting upon themselves, trying to find something else. And they would sit around the dining room table, inhaling various substances that they'd managed to procure from the Department of Chemistry at the university and various other sources. And one evening on November 1847, they sniffed something that they thought didn't look very promising, and all woke up underneath the dining room table. And what happened after that is even more interesting. Rather than write down their findings and decide on what further experiments they were going to do, they invited everyone else who was in the house at the time to partake of this stuff, and kept going till about 3 a.m, and they'd run out of it. It seemed kind of reckless and
very Scottish.
Quite possibly, but this is one of the most important moments in medical history. And it sounded like some kind of drawing room farce or something. So there's all of these little stories.
Sounds like a bunch of Scottish people on a mad one once they'd realised they'd a bottle of something really interesting. And that's the sort of thing that I felt was, elevates the story above the normal dry tales of medical and scientific discovery. That element, I think, made me think this is a world I want to explore. But then the question becomes, how do you do that? Which is far more complicated.
Indeed. What were your initial thoughts about how to approach it?
Well, I suppose one of the reasons, rather than we talked about we could do this together, and what I remember thinking was that it wouldn't be a question of you researching and supplying me with information and me trying to write the story of that world, because it would just, you can't do that. You can't, as a writer, in a way, you almost have to find the story yourself. You have to do your own research. And I felt that your perspective was going to be invaluable, because not only had you researched this from the perspective of doing a history degree, but that you had a perspective upon it as an anaesthetist that would lay bare drama in places that I would otherwise have missed. And so that's why I said we should do this together, meaning collaboratively, and that you should play a large part in finding the story here, because you would find a different story than I would. I do remember even that when you were researching your dissertation and you were trying to find out about whether chloroform had been given in the very early days after its discovery, and you inquired at, I can't remember which particular source, but the archivist or whoever said, "Oh, I don't think there's much on that." And when you looked, there was just no end of information on that, but the archivist didn't know where to look or what was significant about what was written down. So I knew that you could bring something to this that would mean things would be uncovered that I would have missed or any other writer would have missed. But that didn't take away the main problem is if you're trying to tell the story of someone like Simpson, that's a man whose career spans decades and has so many incidents to it. We talked about whether we should try and write a kind of biopic type novel, a sort of novelized fictional biography, and just thought that's quite a cumbersome thing. You literally wouldn't know where to begin, and also there's a lot of tragedy, and I didn't want to take that on. But mainly it came down to the fact that one of the problems when you write about great historical and scientific characters is most people don't relate to genius because we aren't geniuses. So that becomes a problem. Simpson was such an indomitable figure. And although he's so mischievous and he's so colourful, I don't think either of us felt that his was really the story that we wanted to tell in terms of who was the protagonist. And at one point, I remember you toyed with the idea of writing a novel from the point of view of Jessie Simpson.
His wife.
His wife, because of the perspective of the wife in that house. And then I can't remember quite how we shied away from that, but we came up with the idea that, you principally came up with the idea that we should have an apprentice, because having an apprentice character allows you to explain to the reader a lot about the medicine of the time, because Simpson's going to be explaining it to his apprentice. So that started the idea of us writing about the journey of a young man who's going to become a doctor around about that time. But that was just one step in a long process of what led to The Way of All Flesh, because we changed our minds about that a lot. We started writing, as you remember, what we used to call a story that was going to be the battle for this young man's soul. And here's the thing that to many of you out there, if you're aware of my track record of having written about 20 odd crime novels, we were trying not to write a crime novel. And I think that came from me wanting to foreground the medicine and the history and not make all of that sort of subject to the narrative needs of a crime novel, or not write a crime novel that just happened to have a medical historical backdrop to it. I really wanted to engage with the sociology of the time, the social history of the time, and the medicine, the science, all of those things. And we came up with this idea, but it wasn't really flying. And I remember one day you came in and you said, this should be a crime novel, partly because there's so much death. Unavoidably, there's so much death at this time. Inadvertent killings, accidental killings, or just how easy it was to die of no end of things at the time because the medicine at the time was so rudimentary. Or also that you pointed out that certification of death was literally non-existent. So getting away with murder was remarkably easy. So we realised that we were crazy not to be trying to make this a crime novel. So that's when it all clicked into place.
Did you find that having to write a historical crime novel was, did you find it limiting or did you find it freeing? When I say limiting, as in there's a lot of information that you are forced to put in. Well, I forced you to put in really because I was very particular about the historical detail. So you were kind of constrained by some of the historical detail. But on the other hand, perhaps the fact that no one has a mobile phone and no one can be tracked that way, and some of the kind of more complex technological things like contemporary crime writing involved. What did you find? Was it better or worse?
It had its advantages and disadvantages. I think one of the easiest things I found was that because you were writing all the medical stuff and you were able to create all this drama, and also you were able to find drama and narrative in the story of the discovery of chloroform, or the small stories on a sort of micro basis of Simpson's interactions with patients, that kind of thing. It made it easier for me to weave the narrative thread through all of that. What was hard was not so much, I mean, it's a gift when you get given some of those scenes, you know, to have such drama, such literally life and death things going on all the time. But the thing that was limiting was things you would never anticipate. It was things like how little light there is. You know, so you're writing about a room and you have to think, if it's after a certain time of day, how little could be seen in a room, because even if there was any kind of gas lighting, that would give you something. But it was people going around with candles and lamps. It was really dark all the time. Going around Edinburgh after a certain time of night, you had to think about what could or couldn't be seen. Some of those practical implications. I mean, to that end, the third book we've written, we set that at the height of summer, so the days are really long. But it also meant there was the implication for our other main character. We had our apprentice character who's Will Raven, but our other main character of Sarah Fisher, who's a housemaid in the first novel, is that her being a housemaid meant she literally couldn't leave the house. You know, so we've got scenes in the novel where we had to have her try and investigate things, but she had to do it on a Sunday, you know, or make some kind of detour when she had some reason to be out on her domestic duties. And these aren't things that you anticipate, but you shouldn't shy away from them as a crime writer, because they, even though they're inconvenient to the character, they make it more authentic, and they mean you end up telling the story in a way you hadn't anticipated. So in a way, you as a writer, you welcome the problems. And I'm saying this to you now so you'll remember that, because normally, you know, you'll panic when there's some narrative problem creeps into the story.
I think that there's a lot of fun to be had in using some of the real historical stories to start with. But I think it's fair to say that having having very limited creative writing experience, the thing that you kept having to say to me was, you're allowed to make things up. This is fiction. And I think when you're dealing with historical fiction, there's that tension between trying to pay due respect to the real historical characters that you're writing about and the real historical events that you're depicting, and then weaving a fictional narrative in between them. And I think it's fair to say that one of the things we learned early on is that you need to decide what your story is first, and then find which historical bits fit in. You
can't try and come up with a narrative that allows you to crowbar in all the incidents or all the details that you would like to include.
Indeed.
Because the tail will be wagging the dog. Those details will dictate where the story goes rather than the other way around.
Yes.
I think there was always a balancing act between historical reverence and telling a story that works. And I think we did find that balance. You would pick me up on things if I was historically inaccurate, but it wasn't as if I was always straining at the bit to take it away from the history. To me, the exciting thing and the thing that I'm most proud of with the Ambrose books is being able to take genuine historical incidents and characters and weave them in a way that feels like this must have happened. You know, the fictional elements don't seem just incidental to the historical elements and vice versa. You want to feel like the two of them are completely related, but that they're all going on in the same world. And so I love when we can point to the finished novel and be able to say, all these things happened, all these characters are real, but also specific incidents, even the ones that the reader thinks, oh, they must have made that one up because it seems outlandish. And certainly when it comes to Simpson, if it seems outlandish, that means it's probably true.
It's probably true. Absolutely, absolutely.
But we would argue sometimes about, I think you having gone from medicine into a history degree, which was kind of your first brush with the humanities, and it took you a while to understand that that was a different mentality. But having spent all that time learning to distill all this historical information in which there's no right answer, like there can be in science, when it came to creative writing, you had to kind of unlearn some of that distillation and start making things up. That was always difficult. And when it comes to the issue of history, I feel like you don't mess with important things historically, but you can mess with other details. Like, for instance, Simpson's butler. We have it in the novels, he's called Jarvis, and Simpson did have a butler called Jarvis, but not exactly at that period. And we just thought it's a much better name than the name of the butler he had in 1847. So we went with Jarvis. So that's a kind of historical detail that you can happily fudge.
Yeah.
Or the order of things. I mean, I think we've got in the third novel, we've changed slightly when certain things happened in Simpson's life, but it's the big events aren't out of place in the timeline.
No. And I remember with the first book in the series, we obviously wanted to focus on the time around the chloroform discovery, because it seemed foolish to us to kind of not focus on that. But then when it came to the second book, The Art of Dying, it's, well, how do you follow that up? How do you follow up,
You can't discover chloroform twice.
You can't discover chloroform twice. And what was really fascinating to me was the discovery of chloroform was only really just the start. That Simpson spent the next several years fighting to defend it, and all the kind of political chicanery that went on in medicine, and some of the grudges that started coming to the fore because certain people didn't think they had been given enough credit for their part in it. And that informed a lot of the plot of the second book, which, again, when we were trying to decide what to write about, we always start with incidents from Simpson's life and then kind of build a kind of plot around them. So in The Art of Dying, the second book, we took as our starting point the years after chloroform's discovery, when one of Simpson's assistants of the time, James Matthews Duncan, seems to have fallen out with Simpson, and along with a couple of other medical colleagues, accused Simpson of negligently contributing to a patient's death. And so we took that as our starting point, and had our protagonist investigate this particular incident to try it and clear Simpson's name. But then they start discovering other things that lead them to the villain. And again, I think the villains in each of the books we've drawn on real historical characters for. I don't know if you want to say a wee bit about the villain in The Art of Dying.
Well, I think when it comes to I've created so many villains in down the years, but I think I can maybe understand the villains within my own time frame. Whereas when it comes to historical fiction, you're having to think a bit harder about what would have motivated people at the time, or their values different. So it actually helps to draw upon real historical villainy. And we did that with the first novel. Then the second novel, I just remember you were saying, I think I found the model for the villain in the next novel, and I must say I was fairly excited, horrified by what this villain got up to, and then utterly astonished when I learned the more I learned about this woman. And it was, I mean, it's not a spoiler to say that it's a nurse who's murdering patients, because we make that fairly clear quite early on, and it's based on a real historical figure of Jane Toppin, who we will never know how many people this woman murdered, because she worked in hospital wards and was just very, very skilled at covering up what she was doing, and also people just died all the time on those wards anyway. But I think it was when you outlined what she got up to, and we realised we could draw upon that. But when you told me the motivation for what she did, I remember thinking, "Wow, this is horrible, but it's gold in terms of a novelist perspective."
I also remember you being quite shocked, which I thought was fascinating, because you've written some really gross stuff in your time, and you've had some really horrific villains in your novels. So the fact that the motivation of this particular character, you kept saying that you couldn't have made that up yourself.
Yeah, I think that is it. That was perhaps what made me think this is a great character to draw upon, because I could never, in the wildest and weirdest depths of my imagination, have dreamt up this as a motivation for what she was doing. And it's when you come across something that surprises yourself, you know it's going to surprise readers. And that made it really intriguing and invaluable to work with.
I always think that I know that in the past you have been, or people have suggested that you have some very dark and devious thoughts going on in your head. And to me, now that I'm involved in this sort of thing, I always think that it's nice when people say that was really horrible, and you can say, yeah, I didn't make that bit up. You know, that was based on true historical details, true historical characters.
Yeah, I mean, what I really enjoyed drawing upon was obviously the villain is a big part of it, but the sort of minor villainy, or the way we depicted Edinburgh medicine in the second book, because the first book we're establishing how Edinburgh at that time was a world hub for innovation in medicine, a world leader, because we were quite determined to write a Victorian novel that wasn't all about London, and that didn't centre London as the heart of all Victorian life. And so we were quite keen to establish how important Edinburgh was at that point. But in the second book, we also wanted to establish what an utter snake pit it was, because a place where there's great discoveries being made and reputations being made, there's also backs being stabbed. You know, so we wanted to show how there was such ruthlessness, and reputation is all, to the extent that it's one of the things the book deals with is doctors' reluctance to enter the abdomen. And what seemed quite shocking now is not just the reluctance, but the reason for the reluctance, which is that they were terrified of being accused of being reckless, and they didn't really fancy their chances of a result, but they'd rather do nothing and not be accused of being reckless than make what would be deemed a vainglorious attempt to save a patient.
Yeah, there was many of them who actually were quoted as saying, it's better to stand by and let your patient slip away and do something that would be heroic if the patient survived, but the chances of them surviving were not great. So then you were open to the opprobrium of all your colleagues, and they were not slow in kind of throwing the blame about when these things happened. So even after chloroform's discovery and the use of anesthesia in surgery, they were quite slow to start doing more complex things, because there were other things holding them back. Obviously, antisepsis was still to come in to really be fully appreciated, but they were so reluctant to do anything that would upset their colleagues or bring down a whole lot of blame upon their head, because that could be their career over.
And actually, one of the things that was exciting that we wanted to draw upon was, from the perspective of the 21st century, looking at the medicine of the time, there's occasions when you see them come so close, but then not quite get there in terms of understanding what was in front of them. Because that from a historical perspective is fascinating, because you realise how many missteps there has to be, how many near things there are for every eureka moment. And so, especially in The Art of Dying, we looked at, I suppose, to some extent, this sort of scientific process, of, for instance, Raven at one point thinks he's discovered a new disease, and his egotism in a way blinds him to the evidence against his hypothesis. But crucially, we were looking at things like the battle for chloroform, but things like Semmelweis and how close he was coming to an understanding of antisepsis, and yet he had a tragic end because other people weren't prepared to take his ideas on board.
Well, I think with Semmelweis and his hand washing, I think what really rankled his colleagues was he was suggesting it was doctors who were infecting patients and causing them to die.
A wee bit about Semmelweis then, in context.
But yes, he was a doctor working in Vienna in a maternity hospital, and he noticed that there were two wards. There was a maternity ward where the patients were looked after by midwives, and there was a ward where the patients were looked after by medical students and doctors. And the mortality rate in the ward looked after by medical students and doctors was twice that of the other ward. And he reckoned it was because they were coming straight from the dissecting room without washing their hands and then examining patients and delivering babies. And so the incidence of puerperal sepsis was so much higher. However, when he suggested that that's what the problem was, his colleagues became incensed, because basically what he was saying was, you are contributing. Yes, well, you're contributing to the deaths of these patients, and they refused to take that on board. Because he was basically saying the midwives are giving better care to their patients, and they just couldn't stand for that. So they refused to accept what he was saying. But I think certainly when you read about 19th century medicine and surgery, a lot is made of the fact that people or surgeons were not particularly fussy about how clean the theatre was, that there was always blood everywhere. They wore kind of blood encrusted frock coats to do their operations, and the more blood you had on your coat, the better the surgeon you were. But in fact, when you look at it in some detail, there were certain surgeons and physicians who were embracing cleanliness quite early on. Simpson was very keen on hand washing, and a lot of the surgeons operating at the time liked a clean operating theatre. So we were already moving towards this cleanliness before Joseph Lister and his antisepsis moved things forward a little further. So it's fascinating because things often didn't occur out of nowhere. There were lots of people moving in the right direction, sometimes with frustrating detours. Yeah,
I think that's what we were trying to convey with In the Art of Dying, that there's sort of nudging ever so close to certain breakthroughs before the breakthrough is made.
Yeah.
And there's sort of a kind of historical irony to it at times.
Yeah. And I think, again, one of the issues of writing this way, we kept talking about the amount of discipline you needed to have in trying not to crowbar everything you wanted into the story. There's so much stuff that you want to put in, but sometimes it just doesn't fit. And I'm just wondering if you can think of an example of one of the many little stories that we were fond of that we couldn't quite get in.
Oh, I think we maybe didn't get it in directly, but for instance, the fact that Hans Christian Andersen came to stay, I think we did. Did we ever get that in there, or did we just allude to it?
Do you know, I can't remember. There was so many versions where we tried to kind of get it in one way or the other, but it's certainly it might have been mentioned in passing at some point.
Yeah, it's just that it seems on the surface it's the kind of, like when we first talked about the project, you thought, well, so many significant figures from the world of the arts and science, politics, etc., literature, all came to dinner at 52 Queen Street. And one of those stories was about Hans Christian Andersen, and the fact that I think it was ether, wasn't it, rather than chloroform, and they got out the ether bottle after dinner and just were kind of essentially getting high and all giggling and carrying on. And he was appalled by this, especially apparently the fact that the ladies were partaking as well. And he thought this ether was such a boon to humanity, and that this was very irresponsible and disrespectful. And he was really quite appalled and sniffy about it, if you'll forgive the term sniffy. But I just thought, welcome to Scotland. That's kind of what people would do. But we couldn't fit that in, and that's sometimes the difficult decision you make is that there's a little, I guess on a DVD, it would be one of the deleted scenes, but you can't fit it in, and it would get in the way of the story. And in fact, I think it just simply got in the way of the timeline because it happened before the events we were dealing with. So you're sad to see these things, but very little is wasted. You often find there's things that we were writing, thinking we were going to put in the second book that ended up in the third book, and then things in the third book that have now been held over for the fourth book. So
it's tough though, because I find that there's little stories that you get quite attached to, that you're very fond of, and it's quite sad when you can't find a place for them. But as you say, there's a notebook with them all written down, and with a fair wind will probably get them in somehow.
Writing is often a matter of recycling. You never waste anything.
Indeed.
We've got some questions that are coming in. We'll down the side here.
Okay.
Do you want to start taking some of these? Because do keep your questions coming in on the...
Yeah, it's actually lovely to see that there are some questions, because it sometimes feels like there's nobody listening.
Zoom, yes.
Here we're just sitting talking to each other. So one of the questions we have, how was surgery performed before ether or chloroform?
As fast as possible would be the...
I know. I have to say that this was one of the things that we wanted to deal with, especially in the first book, because I don't think you can really appreciate what a phenomenal discovery ether and chloroform were, what that represented, if you didn't actually have some notion of what life was like without it. So in the first book, we do have a scene where an amputation is performed without any anaesthetic. And it's based very much on descriptions that I read about at the time. And it was horrific. I think we probably have a notion, based on films and things that we've seen, that it was biting on a stick or getting yourself so drunk you were unconscious. And in fact, that's not what happened. What happened was you were expected just to bear it. And the only thing the surgeon could do in your favour was be extremely fast. And just prior to ether and chloroform being used, surgeons compared their dexterity and swiftness. And Robert Liston in London, who was one of the first to use ether, prided himself on being able to do a above-knee amputation in 28 seconds, which...
Still a long 28 seconds.
It would still be a very long 28 seconds, but it's quite phenomenal to think that was possible. But that makes me think of one of the other stories that you're so fond of.
I think I made reference to it in my novel Black Widow, because obviously it was pre-Ambrose, but we couldn't have gone into the Ambrose Parry books anyway. But yeah, I just loved this story that Liston was operating, and he was a huge man, wasn't he? And the surgeons would clamp the blood vessels with their hands, wasn't it?
I think the thing is, rather than using a tourniquet, because his hand was so big, he just clamped his hand around the thigh.
He clamped his hand over his assistant on the thigh, when it sliced the assistant's fingers off, and also whipped his knife around and cut the crotch of the trousers of one of the gentlemen who was in the public gallery. And the gentleman in the public gallery died of a heart attack because he thought he wasn't actually injured, but if you just had a Liston knife tear open your crotch, he died of a heart attack. His assistant died of sepsis from the fingers being cut off, and the patient died. So all it was an operation with a 300% mortality rate.
I don't know what that says about you. That's one of your favourite stories. Another question we've had is, what is the most shocking part of Dr. Simpson's life that you discovered while researching for your novel? Shocking, I think that the thing that really got me, and one of the things that I did find genuinely quite shocking, was the professional rivalries and the ease with which colleagues fell out. Dr. Simpson had an ongoing almost feud with the professor of surgery, James Young. They hated each other, and apparently, if the stories are to be believed, almost came to blows in the hallway outside a patient's bedroom one time. And they were always writing horrible things about each other in the medical journals. I think that shocked me, the fact that there was such professional discourtesy, and they were always
very ungentlemanly.
Yes, it was quite staggering how they conducted themselves.
Weirdest irony, and this is something we deal with in the third novel, is about them almost coming to blows, but that when Simpson became very unwell, it was Syme that was sought to
operate on him. Yes, absolutely. And that I can't explain, and in none of the books that I have read, no one offers an explanation as to why Syme was called in to operate on him, because they weren't getting on at the time.
And I don't know if we got this into one of the books, but about talking about the rivalry side of things, was the Professor Gregory of Gregory's powder fame, who was fined after he got into a dispute with
Professor Hamilton
and attacked him with his stick. And when he was fined, he said outside the court that he was fined £100, which you can imagine must have been a substantial amount at the time. But he said he would gladly pay it again for another go at him, which I think would get you done for contempt of court these days.
I think the other shocking thing about Simpson's life was the amount of personal tragedy that he and his family had to endure. I think that was one of the things that really stuck with me. He had 9 children, but 5 died before he did. And I think when you read his own accounts about the loss of his young daughters, it's really appalling. Obviously, it wasn't that unusual for children to die, but he had so many deaths in his family. It was shocking and tragic, and we haven't actually got to that yet.
We've got some, but not the really tragic,
not the really awful stuff. But and I think that's one of the things that really humanises a character for you. It wasn't all about his great triumphs and being a very famous man. I think one of the terrible ironies was the fact that he was so lauded as a physician, and yet he couldn't do anything for the children that died. Yeah.
There's a lovely question here saying, did you make use of the archives at the Royal College of Physicians Edinburgh as part of your work? If you did, what has been your favourite how amazing moment?
Oh, there is one actually. I did a lot of research at Lothian Health Board's archive. That's where a lot of my primary research was done. But I did go to the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh, where the librarian let me look into their Simpsons box. They have this box that contains a little medicine tin that has little compartments for pills and potions, and the inside of the lid it says, "Please return to 52 Queen Street," which I loved. And there was also, I remember, in that box, a notebook belonging to Simpson from the 1830s when he was just newly in practice as an obstetrician. And it was his handwritten notes about some of his clinical cases. And I remember, and it had soot stains around the outside of it. And it was his handwriting, which I have to admit is not easy to read. And it was that I had chills looking at that. And there was a case he described of a very difficult, tedious labour, as he put it. And he said that the baby was eventually born with the last efforts of jaded nature. And I just find it incredible the way that these people express themselves. So yes, that was a big highlight for me.
There's also at the Lothian Health Board that really struck you, the categorisation. That was the thing that brought home how different things were about the condition of the baby.
Yes. I was so fortunate actually at the Lothian Health Board's archive. They have the case books from the maternity hospital in Edinburgh from the 1840s. So I was able to see when they first used ether and chloroform on the maternity patients there. And what also amazed me was in the 1990s, I worked at the Simpson Memorial Hospital in Edinburgh, and we had to write down all our cases, anaesthetic cases, in big leather-bound case books. That makes me sound like I'm about a million years old, but that's what we did at the time. And the archival case books looked exactly the same. There were these massive leather-bound ledgers, but they noted down the sort of things that we still note down today about expectant mothers, their name and age and how many babies they'd had before. But the thing that really shocked me was they had 3 categories for the condition of the infant at birth. One was alive, one was dead, and the third category was putrid. And I remember looking at that thinking, that tells you so much about what having babies was like in the mid-19th century. That was pretty shocking, but very illuminating.
The questions are still coming in, which is gratifying. Quick one here. When will the third novel be published? The third novel is called A Corruption of Blood, and it will be published in August of this year.
I'm pleased to say it's finished.
That's what we did during the summer lockdown. I had just finished a novel and there was literally nothing else to do, and we just, with everything going on around us, it was actually a luxury to lose ourselves in the 19th century. And so we wrote A Corruption of Blood from really, I think we wrote it over the summer and into the autumn, and we've just about to do the copy edit on it. So yes, it'll be out in August, and if we're all vaccinated and things do improve, we hope to be launching it at the Edinburgh Book Festival. Whether that'll be a actual live event or a hybrid online event remains in the lap of the gods. Yes.
There's also a question here that says, as a medical person, did you have to study creative writing to get started? Well, certainly it's always, I think as a medical person, I always think you need to have some kind of certificate before you should really embark on anything. However, I didn't pursue a creative writing degree or anything like that, but I did go on several creative writing courses, which were hugely helpful. And my favourite one was Moniac Moor, which is just outside Inverness, where you go for a week. And it's very kind of immersive. It was a bit scary actually, but it was very immersive and hugely helpful. And if anyone's interested, I'd highly recommend it.
Yeah, I remember saying that one of the reasons we embarked upon this was that if I didn't think you were equipped for creative writing, I wouldn't have suggested it, because we talked a lot about structure and story ideas, and Marissa's always my first reader, and actually came up with the plot of Quite Ugly One Morning, which you were reluctant to take credit for because of working in an Edinburgh hospital at the time, and a plot that involved killing off patients to clear beds wasn't something you wanted to be associated with.
Yes, it was a satire, though. It was a satire.
And similarly, Black Widow, you helped out with a lot of the story and a lot of the information on that. So I was quite confident that, you know, once you found your feet, you would quickly get a feel for it. But I think Moniac Moor was a good idea because it was immersive. You know, you were taken away for 5 days and just surrounded by nothing but countryside and other people trying to write. And I recall you you were quite transformed by the process because it is a kind of in at the deep end thing.
Very much so.
I'm just looking at more questions here. Oh, how integrated is your writing? If you look at a page now, can you remember who wrote it, or is every page a mixture from both of you? I think a lot of it we can't remember who wrote what because we tend to rewrite each other's material. And with the first book was Marisa wrote all the medical scenes, and then I repurposed them with a view to developing the plot, and she wrote all of the Sarah chapters, and again I would sort of revise those. But once I'd repurposed scenes from Raven's point of view, Marisa would rewrite those. But there's certain things I do remember that I know Marisa wrote them because I thought I'd never have thought of that, especially the sort of medical, historical, technical side of it. But I think because we've been doing this now for a few books, we get to a stage where we're both trying to write like each other. So it's a weird thing. We're sort of, if I'm writing a scene, I'll think, how would Marisa phrase this? And similarly, she'll do the same. But there are still moments when you look at it, and or there's times when I'll say, oh, that was a great line of yours, and you'll say, that wasn't me.
Although I remember very clearly when the first editorial notes came in for The Way of All Flesh, and our editor had made comments at the side about things he wanted changed or cut or whatever. But there was also sections that were just highlighted in yellow. And when we asked what that was, he said, oh, that's just the bits I particularly like. And I remember going through, pointing out the yellow highlighted bits, going, yeah, that was me, claiming most of them.
It's been an evolving process. I think that with each book, the way we work together has changed. And the third book, we've been very efficient that way. During the summer, I would go out for long walks. I work by walking and by dictating into my phone. And normally what I would do is transcribe my thoughts and then expand upon them and then turn them into chapters. And what I was doing was transcribing very roughly, then handing that to you, and you would expanding, knowing where the story was going. Or sometimes there was whole sections that you were writing on your own while I was trying to develop the other side of the story. So it's I think it will be different with every book that we write. It's
I think it's getting more efficient. I think, but certainly it's definitely even more collaborative now than it was at the beginning, and it's harder than ever to kind of decide who wrote what. I think.
To see where one of us ends and the other begins. There's an interesting question as well. What other historical medical figure appeals to you for a future Ambrose Parry book once the trilogy's finished? Well, it's not really a question of a trilogy because we just want to keep going with expanding this world, but it's the world of Edinburgh at the time, and the orbit around Simpson has got so many interesting people in it.
Oh, so yes, absolutely.
The third novel has a character in it, Elizabeth Blackwell, who you can maybe say a wee bit more about. She's not central to the story, but
no, she was the first woman who obtained a medical degree, although it was in the States, not in Britain. But she was the first woman to be registered on the General Medical Council, registered in 1858. She was really quite an inspiring figure, and we have introduced her because she's going to be an inspiration for one of our protagonists, Sarah, who's very interested in studying medicine, but obviously is going to have a great deal of difficulty because she's a woman. So we kind of see this not as a trilogy, but as a series of books that take you through most of the kind of important medical developments in the kind of 19th century, and hopefully get to a point where women did start to study medicine in Edinburgh, although that's not until the 1860s. But that we would love to be able to keep going till we got to that point.
Yeah, we've been sowing the seeds as well, because, for instance, there's the character of Henry, who appears in the first novel, and the second novel he's off in Berlin with Raven, and we don't actually tell you his surname until I think the third novel, and he's Henry Littlejohn, who you can maybe
well,
elaborate on
he's
that.
the first medical officer for health in Edinburgh, and he was a police surgeon at one point too. He's a very famous Edinburgh physician. And
his paintings in the portrait gallery.
Yes, he's so we really wanted to draw upon him as a character, and also the interconnectedness of a lot of things that surprises me a great deal. For example, we are now, well, I think when we come to the next book, we're going to be 1853, 1854, which is when James Syme gets a new surgical assistant, and who marries James Syme's daughter and becomes his son-in-law, and that is Joseph Lister. And obviously I know about Joseph Lister, Mr. Antisepsis, but I always associate him with Glasgow Royal Infirmary, but he was in Edinburgh first. So you just think this is a gift that keeps on giving. The more you read, the more you find out, and the more interesting it becomes. There was also a question that I saw, it says, who would you rate more highly, Simpson or Jon Snow? Which is a great question, because Jon Snow was around at the same time as Simpson. Jon Snow worked in London and became he worked basically as an anaesthetist after the discovery of ether and chloroform, and he had a very scientific approach to the whole thing, where Simpson was a little more cavalier, I would say. Snow was really quite a remarkable man, and he wrote extensively about how to safely administer anaesthetics, and even developed a vaporizer, which in theory looks very much like modern day vaporizers. It's fascinating. So I think, however, Simpson is a more interesting character to write about because he had so many different facets to his character. The fact that he was a bit reckless, and a bit cavalier about his own safety.
There's so much mischief and humour about him, and that's something you really need to leaven the seriousness and the high stakes.
Yes, but I have huge respect for Jon Snow, but he and Simpson were very, very different men, I think.
Well, just a couple more questions because we're running out of time. One was just someone's asking, was it common for an apprentice to live with his mentor? I don't think it was, but it did happen with Simpson.
Oh, Simpson had senior medical students live in with him before they graduated, and they worked with him and learned with him. The apprentice system was a bit of an old-fashioned system, and it didn't officially exist. It used to be the official way that you trained in Edinburgh, but around the 1840s it wasn't the official system, but Simpson still did it. He still had apprentices move into the house with him, which again was a gift to us, wasn't it? But yes, so that was true.
And I think as we're almost up to the hour, a question that's been asked, and it always gets asked at events, was why Ambrose Parry? Seems a good point to round things off.
Well, interestingly, Ambrose Parry, we decided on the pseudonym before we had done anything else. That was the easy bit, wasn't it? Ambrose Parry was a French military surgeon in the 16th century, and he was very famous for lots of advances that he made in terms of suturing surgical wounds, in terms of translating Latin texts into French so that they were more widely available. And he wrote extensively about obstetrics, and described one of the manoeuvres that features in the first book. And also, when I did my history of medicine degree, the first tutorial that we ever had, his name came up, and it stuck with me for some reason. And when we realized we were going to require a pseudonym for our collaborative work, that was the one that we came up with.
You said we should be called Ambrose Parry, and it was Ambroise Parry, and you anglicised it, and I thought it was a great idea. It evokes a different historical period, so it doesn't sound so modern. So yeah, it was the first thing we actually decided.
It was the first thing we agreed on, and it was a tribute, really, wasn't it? It was in tribute to the man himself.
But I think all that remains now is for us to say thanks to everybody for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much for listening to us chat to each other in our living room.
Eavesdropping on us in our living room this evening. I do hope it's been instructive and informative.
Yep.
And
we're very grateful to have been invited, and we really hope that in the not too distant future we can come and speak at the College of Physicians in person to an audience. That would be wonderful, and hopefully that will be the case.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.